between 50,000 and 125,000 Christians killed, over 19,000 churches attacked or destroyed, and the United States government just put that number officially in a piece of legislation aimed directly at Nigeria. Now here's the question nobody in this conversation is asking. When a foreign government writes a bill that specifically demands another country change its laws that have been in place for 25 years, is that human rights advocacy or is that something else entirely? Because the US isn't just expressing concern here, they are threatening to withhold funding, impose travel bans, freeze assets, and they have specifically named Sharia law in 12 northern Nigerian states as part of the problem. Think about what that means for a country of 230 million people, roughly split down the middle between Muslims and Christians. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what's really being played here, and it's bigger than religion. Before we go deeper, if you're just finding Niger News Feed, welcome. This channel exists to break down what's really happening in Nigerian politics, without the noise, without the spin. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because this one gets interesting. By the time we get to the international angle on this, you'll understand why the timing of all this is not an accident. Let's start from the beginning, because this didn't come out of nowhere. On October 31st, 2025, Halloween, fittingly, President Donald Trump signed an executive directive redesignating Nigeria as a country of particular concern. That's a formal U.S. classification under the International Religious Freedom Act, reserved for governments that either commit or tolerate severe violations of religious freedom. Nigeria was first placed on that list in 2020 under Trump's first term. Then Biden quietly removed it in 2021 before Trump came back and put it right back on. Trump didn't stop there. He publicly threatened military action against Boko Haram inside Nigerian territory. He ordered congressional Republicans to investigate what he called the slaughter of Christians in Nigeria and report back to him directly. That investigation led to a series of congressional hearings throughout late 2025, joint sessions between the House Appropriations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Multiple witnesses testified, trips were made to Nigeria, affidavits were collected, and on February 10, 2026, Reps Riley Moore and Chris Smith introduced H.R. 7457, the Nigeria Religious Freedom and Accountability Act of 2026. And embedded in that bill is a direct call for Nigeria to repeal Sharia and blasphemy laws across 12 northern states. Now, what triggered this escalation specifically? Three things: the abduction of 303 children and 12 teachers from St. Mary's Catholic School in Niger State on November 22, 2025. Reports of ongoing blasphemy imprisonment, including a Sufi musician named Yahaya Sharif Aminu, who has been on death row in Kano State for 6 years over song lyrics. And a pattern of mass killings in Benue and Plateau states that the bill directly attributes to Fulani ethnic militias, killings the Nigerian government has consistently described as farmer-herder conflict, not religious persecution. That framing, religious persecution versus resource conflict, is at the heart of everything. Here's the thing that almost nobody reporting on this is mentioning, and it fundamentally changes how you read this story. Here's what you need to understand about how Sharia law actually operates in Nigeria, because the US bill talks about 12 states as though they're all doing the same thing, and that's not accurate. Sharia criminal law was introduced in Zamfara state in 2000, and within a couple of years, 11 other northern states followed: Kano, Katsina, Sokoto, Kebbi, Jigawa, Borno, Yobe, Bauchi, Gombe, and then Kaduna and Niger, but only partially. The degree of enforcement varies enormously state by state. In some states, it's active and aggressive. In others, it's largely symbolic. Now, here's the thing that almost nobody reporting on this is mentioning. Nigeria's 1999 constitution under Section 10 explicitly states that the government of the federation or of a state shall not adopt any religion as state religion. Nigeria is constitutionally a secular state, so the question of whether Sharia criminal law, as opposed to personal law governing Muslims in civil matters, is even constitutional has never been definitively settled by the Supreme Court. It has been challenged. Those challenges have largely gone nowhere, and that ambiguity has allowed these laws to persist for 25 years. The Hisbah, the Sharia enforcement police, operate in states like Kano and Zamfara with their own uniforms, their own structures, and significant local political support. They are state-level institutions, not federal.
And that distinction is critical because here's the constitutional reality. The Nigerian president cannot unilaterally abolish Sharia in the north. That's not within his powers under the constitution. It would require state-level legislative action in each of the 12 states, and in some cases possibly a constitutional amendment. Reuben Abati, former presidential spokesperson, said this plainly on Arise TV. Tinubu cannot abolish Sharia, full stop. Any U.S. demand that he do so is either a misunderstanding of Nigerian federalism or, more likely, a deliberate pressure tactic they know is structurally impossible to fulfill.
Now let's talk about what's actually happening beneath the surface, because this story has at least 3 layers and most people are only reading the top one. Layer 1. The domestic U.S. politics. Let's be honest, this is happening in the context of the Trump administration's second term, and Trump's political coalition includes a very significant evangelical Christian base. The framing of Nigerian Christians facing genocide maps perfectly onto that constituency's worldview. Senator Ted Cruz, who introduced companion Senate legislation, has been one of the loudest voices on this. Congressman Chris Smith has now chaired 13 congressional hearings on religious persecution in Nigeria. This has been a long-running project for a specific wing of the Republican Party, and Trump gave it rocket fuel by threatening military action. The timing matters. Trump reinstated the CPC designation on October 31, 2025, just weeks into his new term. The message to his base was clear. The message to Nigeria was also clear. We are watching you and there are consequences. Layer 2. What Nigeria stands to lose. The United States is Nigeria's largest foreign investor. Bilateral trade exceeded $13 billion in 2024. The U.S. provides military training, counter-terrorism support, and limited arms to help Nigeria fight Boko Haram and ISWAP. The proposed legislation would tie future U.S. assistance to demonstrable action by Nigeria, meaning aid conditionality is now on the table. H.R. 7457 specifically proposes withholding certain funding until the State Department can certify Nigeria is taking steps on blasphemy laws, protecting religious minorities, and dismantling extremist networks. For a government already dealing with a struggling naira, rising debt, and economic pressure from its own reform agenda, that's not a small threat. Now, if what I just laid out surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know your take before we get to the part that changes the whole picture. Layer 3. The North-South fault line inside Nigeria. Here is where this gets politically explosive domestically. Nigeria's north has already responded. A coalition of northern elders has publicly rejected any calls to ban Sharia, calling U.S. pressure and interference in Nigeria's sovereignty. And they are not wrong to read it that way, because whatever the human rights justification, the practical effect of Washington demanding the abolition of a 25-year-old legal institution that 70 to 80 million northern Muslims operate under is significant. President Tinubu, himself a Muslim from the southwest, is caught in an almost impossible position. He cannot afford to alienate the north, which remains politically indispensable. He cannot afford to lose Washington's support. He has responded by trying to show action without conceding the core narrative. Ordering airstrikes on Boko Haram targets, recruiting 30,000 additional police, declaring a national security emergency. But he has also said publicly, and this is important, that the characterization of Nigeria as religiously intolerant does not reflect our national reality. That's a direct rebuttal of the U.S. framing. The question of who gets to define what's happening in Nigeria, Nigerians or Washington, is something I'm going to come back to at the end of this video, because the answer tells you everything about where this is heading. Now, who are the silent players here? Watch the governors of the 12 northern states. Ted Cruz specifically called for sanctions on individual state governors who enforce Sharia and blasphemy laws, travel visa bans, asset freezes. That is a direct threat to the political survival of those governors. It also means Washington is effectively trying to bypass Abuja and deal with northern politicians directly. That is not diplomacy in the traditional sense. The economic number that nobody is putting next to this story. Let's zoom out and think about what this means for Nigeria as a whole. The first implication is constitutional. If the US succeeds in pressuring Nigeria to abolish Sharia criminal law, even partly, it would set a precedent that federal authority can override state-level legal frameworks under foreign pressure. That reshapes the federal-state relationship in ways that go beyond religion. Every state's legislative autonomy becomes theoretically conditional on Washington's approval. That's a governance crisis, not just a religious one. The second implication is economic, and here's the number nobody is putting next to this story. Bilateral US-Nigeria trade was over $13 billion in 2024. Nigeria's €2.3 billion Eurobond, which Tinubu referenced publicly as proof of economic confidence, was oversubscribed by 400%. That means foreign investors still believe in...
Here's the part that tells you this isn't just a Nigeria story. This isn't just a Nigeria story. And here's why the timing is not an accident. The US legislation specifically calls on the State Department to enlist the support of France, Hungary, and the United Kingdom in pressuring Nigeria. France has significant interest in the Sahel, where ISWAP and affiliated groups are expanding. The UK has deep historical ties to Nigeria and remains one of the largest bilateral partners. Hungary, under Viktor Orban, has made the protection of persecuted Christians a signature foreign policy position. The coalition being assembled here is not random. This also fits into a broader pattern in Trump's foreign policy, using religious freedom designations as leverage in regions where the US wants to maintain strategic influence and where China is expanding. Nigeria has been deepening economic ties with China. Its refusal to fully align with Western positions on Ukraine and other geopolitical questions has created friction. The CPC designation and the Sharia debate give Washington a different kind of pressure point, one that doesn't require military deployment but achieves strategic goals. For Nigerians in the diaspora, particularly in the US and UK, this creates a painful bind. Many of you are acutely aware of the violence in the Middle Belt and the North. Many of you have family members who've been affected. At the same time, many of you, whatever your faith, are uncomfortable watching a foreign government dictate the terms of your country's internal legal structure. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. The question is whether Washington's intervention will produce better outcomes on the ground or whether it will produce diplomatic compliance that changes nothing in practice while making the domestic politics of reform harder. Let me examine both sides fairly, because the loudest voices on this issue are not always the most honest. What the US lawmakers are getting right? The violence in the north and middle belt of Nigeria is real. It is catastrophic. The bill's own figures, disputed by some, cite between 50,000 and 125,000 Christians killed between 2009 and 2025, and more than 19,000 churches attacked or destroyed. Even if those numbers are high estimates, the underlying crisis is not invented. Blasphemy laws that carry the death penalty and that have been used against Christians, Muslims, and dissenters alike are a genuine problem. Yahya Sharif Aminu, a Sufi Muslim musician on death row in Kano for 6 years over song lyrics, is not a Christian. The victims of these laws are not exclusively from one faith. What the US lawmakers are getting wrong, or at least incomplete. The bill frames this almost entirely as anti-Christian persecution. But the violence in the north is multi-causal. Armed Fulani militias and bandit groups have attacked mosques, Muslim communities, and secular communities too. The congressional record itself notes that in August 2025, bandits abducted over 100 individuals from a mosque in Zamfara state and killed 27 worshippers in a mosque in Katsina state. The narrative of a purely anti-Christian campaign, while politically useful in Washington, obscures a more complex security collapse that requires security sector reform, not just religious law reform. The sovereignty argument. Critics in Nigeria, including Ruben Abati, who is himself a Christian, have said America is not dictating to Nigeria. What's actually happening, he argues, is that a congressional committee produced a report following an investigation. That's different from a formal US government policy demand. That distinction matters legally, but politically, When you are threatening to withhold aid and sanction individual governors, the distinction between a report and a demand becomes pretty thin. The biggest misconception, that Tinubu has the power to abolish Sharia. He doesn't. The structure of Nigerian federalism makes this a state-level question. Any US pressure that assumes otherwise is either naive or strategic, designed to put Tinubu in a position where he looks like he's refusing to act when structurally he cannot act unilaterally. I told you at the start that the timing of this isn't an accident. Here's what I mean. So where does this go from here? Let me give you 4 things to watch. Watch the appropriations process. H.R. 7457 has strong Republican support and a clear pathway through the House. If it passes, the State Department will be required to produce a formal report within 180 days, essentially creating an official accountability mechanism that puts Nigeria on a watch list and creates conditions for future sanctions. That report becomes a tool that can be deployed anytime Washington wants leverage. Watch the northern governors. Ted Cruz's proposed sanctions targeting state governors personally, their ability to travel, their assets, changes the political calculation for individual governors. Some may quietly begin distancing themselves from the most aggressive Hisbah enforcement, not because of ideological change, but because of personal exposure. That's actually how targeted sanctions are supposed to work. Watch whether any northern state quietly reforms its blasphemy enforcement practices without publicly acknowledging why. Watch Tinubu's diplomatic moves. He hasn't visited Washington since taking office in 2023. He recalled all Nigerian ambassadors in 2023 and still hasn't filled many of those positions. That diplomatic vacuum is now a strategic liability. Expect Tinubu to move towards a formal meeting with Trump, possibly a state visit or a bilateral security agreement designed to give Washington enough of a win to reduce the pressure while protecting the core of northern political arrangements. Best case scenario, a US-Nigeria security pact gets announced, Tinubu gets photo op credit for arresting some high-profile terrorists, a few blasphemy cases get quietly resolved like Umar Farouk, who was pardoned in December 2025 after 10 years in prison, and the designation gets managed down diplomatically. Worst case scenario, the appropriations language passes with hard conditionality. Sanctions hit northern governors, northern political elites align against Tinubu, creating a political crisis that further destabilizes the federal government. Boko Haram and ISWAP exploit the chaos, and the Christians in the Middle Belt, the people this entire exercise claims to be protecting,